very much, Luis and Karthik, for joining us so early in your morning. You have a full room of very, very, curious audience wanting to listen to you. In a forum like this of people who are seriously studying education policy, Luis Crouch and Dr. Karthik Muralidharan need no introduction, but I do feel we need to make a formal explanation of what they have contributed to us and to the domain. So I'll start with Luis, and then I'll bring in Karthik. Luis Crouch is a retired Emeritus Senior Economist at RTI's International Development Group. He has worked in more than 25 countries in a 30-year career in development and is the author of many reports, technical papers, and books. He specializes in education policy, decentralized finance, and the political economy of reform. And he's also worked in the World Bank and previously also worked at the Global Partnership for Education. His more recent work is in early grade reading and the early childhood development, which we just spoke about as key entry points into improving quality of education. We are also very fortunate to have Luis on our board, and as Shweta said, someone who's a critical friend and also advises and keeps us honest. And the prompt we had for Luis was to help us understand that over the last few decades, countries outside of India have tried reforms across the board, but especially in the field of foundational learning. Luis, we'd love to hear from you. What are some of the insights that India can take away in its journey of foundational learning from countries outside ours? Over to you, Luis.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, and I greatly admire what you are doing and what India is doing. And my remarks will be not so much directed at what India can learn, but what countries in general can learn from the successful cases. And I'll try to stick to 10 minutes as requested. Let me set my timer. What I'll be summarizing years of research in just 10 minutes. So it's a tall order, but if I can summarize by saying that I'll be summarizing research on foundational learning from a few of the pioneers, such as Kenya, South Africa, and a few others. There's also some specific states within India that I think are good models. So you're already doing it, in a sense. It's more a matter of learning from what you're already doing in the case of India. And I'll be drawing some that I would call sort of lower level lessons from that, kind of specific things that have been done. And that's going to be focused on teaching, just the essential nature of teaching to success in this area. And from that, I will unfurl a few other things. But if you want to keep one thing in mind is teaching. Not management, not administration, not teaching. And secondly, I'll be drawing on some lessons learned on research that I've done more recently on how Korea and Japan used education to overcome the legacy of colonialism and to resist colonialism by developing absolutely world-class education systems that were used to propel the nation to greatness. So let me start with the lower level. And let me also state that I was asked to talk about how to rapidly develop better learning outcomes. I want to say how to rapidly, but also sustainably develop learning outcomes, because it's easy to have a little spurt or even a big spurt and not necessarily sustain it. I want to talk about how to do it on an ongoing basis over a period that may start in a few years and see success in a few years, but have evidence over a few decades. So the more specific, or sort of what I would call lower level lessons, not to denigrate them by saying lower level, they're just more specific, more on the ground, has to do with teaching methods. And I really want to put the emphasis on teaching, not teachers, because the evidence that we have seen from around the world suggests that at least when you're getting started, when you're getting moving, when you're getting off a low base, what you do with the teachers you already have matters a lot. So it's at the initial stage, and to make that initial leap, it's not a matter of getting better teachers into the system or selection or whatever. It's working with the teachers you already have and improving the management and the support of those teachers to improve their teaching. And what I want to highlight on that, if you want to keep in mind just the centrality of teaching, is that what most of the research I've seen suggests that the key to that is some form of structured pedagogy. Now, that's a bit of a loaded term, so let me unpack it just a little bit. What that means is instruction, and by that I mean instruction, not self-discovery by the kids. You can't discover your way into reading and basic maths. You can discover your way into, let's say, literature appreciation or art or social studies, but in reading and math, it's a matter of instruction that is explicit and direct in the classroom, and based on technique, based on research, based on evidence. The evidence is now very clear that has a fairly big impact, much bigger than, say, managerial reforms and so on. Now, the important thing is that to sustain those improvements in teaching, you do need the managerial reforms. But the core, the place where you start, is the classroom, and what's going on in the classroom, and what's happening with the teaching. And again, direct, explicit instruction according to well-planned year-long program of studies, where the lessons are essentially planned and known to work day by day, or at least week by week. And the teachers have a lot of certainty and support in implementing a structured program that is research-based and has been shown to work. And you start there. You start with the centrality of teaching, and then pretty soon you discover that tied to the centrality of teaching are a few other things. You have to have textbooks or reading books or whatever that tie to the teaching, that sequentially follow the lesson plans for the year in the book, so that the book and the lesson plans are perfectly aligned, perfectly integrated, and the books are delivered on time so that the teacher doesn't get started teaching without books. The books are there on time, and they follow the sequence of lessons over the year very precisely. Secondly, you need to have assessment. What we found is that frequent assessment doesn't have to be complicated or lengthy, just little spot checks, mastery checks as the year goes along to help the teacher see where their kids are at. And often it can be administered by an external coach or an external person that supports the teachers. And I think the research shows that data on whether the kids are reading or doing their mathematics or their arithmetic needs to be seen mostly in a supportive role, to find out how better to support the teachers professionally, to some degree in an accountability role, but never in a punitive role, So it's mostly supportive, mostly around professional accountability. Again, as part of what begins to unfurl when you're focused on teaching is that you need to have time to do it. So there needs to be time in the syllabus devoted specifically to the mechanics of teaching reading and teaching arithmetic, not just sort of language arts or language appreciation or grammar or these kinds of things. It's the mechanics of actually decoding and deciphering what the text means and doing it fluently and creatively and with expression. That's key, just having the time. A couple of other things unfurl from the teaching. The research shows that it's better if you do it in mother tongue, or at least in a language that the kids actually do speak, and maybe even a language that the kids actually think in. And so these things, the books, the assessment, the support, the mother tongue, that's part of a package. The other thing that we've discovered is that it's good not to borrow these things internationally, but to experiment with it yourselves for the given country, to iterate and to adapt. Now, once you have iterated and adapted for as long as it takes, maybe a year or two or three, then you can be a little bit top down and a little bit centralist. So at first you're bottom up, and once you have something that really works, you can be a little bit top down. The important thing is not to be top down with the teachers until you're absolutely sure that the recommendations that you're making work. Because nothing is more destructive than to get teachers doing something that doesn't work. Because then they lose their trust in you, and they lose the trust in the system. So it's very important that what one does be as research-based as possible, but then locally iterated and adapted until you have something that really works and that you can be morally and managerially assured when you tell the teachers, do this, that thing that you're telling them to do, that thing works. And that's hugely important. We often tell the teachers to do things that are based on theory, based on what some other country did. You know, the Brits have Ofsted, so let's do that, without locally adapting it and making sure that it really works. Okay, the last message, and I'll be able to finish pretty much on time, or at least within the 12 minutes, has to do with purpose. And that's my more recent research on Korea and Japan. And by the way, it can be, at some point, we can share the URL for this research, the links. It has to do with how Japan and Korea saw education not just as a kind of as a human rights thing or as a democracy thing or those are important, don't get me wrong, those are good. Not just as a commitment to the global community in terms of 100%, the SDGs or this or that or what. They saw education as fundamentally central to the survival of the nation and to creating a strong, ideally great nation, but if not, at least a good nation, a strong, capable nation that was explicitly capable of standing on its own and becoming a proud nation in the community of the world in terms of its own traditions, its own abilities, and in an explicit sense, in the case of Japan and Korea, as a form of resistance to colonization. But at the same time, learning from the West. So Japan did something amazing that you don't see anymore these days, which is in the late 19th century, they sent a mission of 145 top-level government officials abroad to the United States, Prussia, at the time, the forerunner of Germany, the UK, and France. And they spent 2 years studying these systems. And then they brought back not some kind of thing that the World Bank told them to do, or FCDO told them to do, or USAID, or DFID, whatever it told them to do, but what they saw as important, what they saw as useful. And for example, they explicitly rejected many of the things that were being done in the UK and borrowed more some of the things that were being done in the United States. So they would, and then they questioned. There's a lot of questioning over a decade or two of all these ideas. It wasn't something that they got from a donor. And they involved the teachers, and there were research groups, and they really went to town on adapting and understanding things. Can you imagine these days sending 145 top-level government officials abroad for a long time to really figure this out, and then adapt it to your own country as a form of resisting, so borrowing from the West, but also resisting the West. And that getting that combination artfully done was what really helped Japan and Korea. And last thing, I'll just take 2 seconds to say that, what they were centered on was getting the foundations right, getting the foundational learning right. So in Japan and Korea, they made sure that 100% of the kids were getting an excellent primary education before opening too much. I mean, they opened some, but before opening too much access to secondary and access to tertiary education. Now, the world has changed since the late 19th century or since the middle of the 20th century, but that's what they did, is really make sure that everybody in the society has an equal access, and they did that, and I hesitate to use this word almost because it's so sociological, but they did that as a form of class analysis, social class analysis. Korea and Japan wanted everyone in the society, not just the educated elites, not just the samurai class in the case of Japan, to have access to an excellent education, everybody. So this commitment to equality as the basis of national greatness is what characterized these countries, and their focus on the foundations as a result of that or derived from that kind of focus on developing the nation. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I rushed so much. I think I was on about 12 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for that very illuminating presentation and for reminding us for what is important, the verb in teaching and the sense of purpose in the education systems in other countries which have achieved success. Now I'm delighted to invite Professor Karthik Muralidharan, who is very, very well known in Indian policy circles. Karthik now is a professor of economics at the University of California, San Diego, where he also holds the Tata Chancellor's Endowed Chair in Economics. Karthik also serves as the co-chair in education of the JPAL, the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab. He's also founded CGIS, which is an organization aimed to improve lives by helping state governments deliver better development outcomes. Karthik, the prompt we had for Karthik was to help us understand how do we build state capacity now that India has decided to firmly invest in foundational learning. The binding constraint is the quality of our implementation and execution by the state. Over to you, Karthik, for your 12 minutes.
Thank you, Anustup. Can you hear me out there?
Yes, we can hear you, Karthik.
Perfect. Thanks, and it was actually a great pleasure to go after Louis because effectively I doubled my time because he said half of what I would say. So I agree with really basically everything Louis said. And let me just kind of reinforce. So I'm going to make 4 big points, right? So I think one is the centrality of just, centrality of evidence and cost effectiveness. And, I've written a lot about this. I've done podcasts on this. People can find a lot more material. But the headline result is if you look at what we've done in education in the past 20 years, in the words of Anil Swarup, right, the former Education Secretary of India. So this is not just like some critical external academic or nonprofit coming in complaining about the government. In the words of the former Education Secretary to the government of India, he says, other than building schools and getting kids into the schools, the education system has basically failed to deliver on almost every other goal of education, including learning outcomes. Okay, so I think the good news is obviously that we have recognized the centrality of learning outcomes. The new education policy puts FLN at the foundation, and then Nipun as a program is now acting on that. So this is all good news. Okay. Now, so the question here is, how do we take all of this intention and convert that into action and convert that into results? So I'm going to say a few. One thing so what does the research say, right? And the research basically says that the default approach to how we thought about education, right to education, education access has really just been about inputs. But essentially what the data says is that the business as usual or government as usual inputs alone simply don't seem to be moving the needle. Now, I'm not saying you don't need the inputs, right? So you need the schools. So it's not like you don't need the schools or you don't need the feeding programs. It's that they may be enablers, but they're not sufficient. Okay. So when I say that the inputs don't seem to matter, that should not be interpreted as saying don't do the inputs. Okay. I think the more important point is that the way kind of bureaucracies define their goals is they convert goals into schemes. Okay, so the goals of access, quality, equity, these are all very good goals, but access gets converted into a goal of school construction. Quality gets converted into a goal of training and facilities and upgrading infrastructure. And equity gets converted into schemes for different kinds of disadvantaged groups. Okay, so the point is not that these goals don't matter. The point is that how we operationalize those goals typically kind of takes converting it into a scheme, which then becomes a bunch of inputs, and then the entire system focuses on the logistics of delivering those inputs as opposed to making sure that we're getting the outcomes that we care about. So I think the first point is just that we have a crisis, we have a learning crisis. There is just no point sugarcoating this. We have recognized it. That's the good news. We're acting on it. That's the good news. And what the research says is that the binding constraints to effective learning and is pedagogy and governance. Okay, so I'm really happy that Louis talked about pedagogy because it's really what even advocates of the RTE have told me in private that the RTE was really Right to Education Facilities Act, right? I mean, as opposed to a Right to Education Act. Okay, so I think we've recognized the centrality of governance and pedagogy as the key binding constraints in translating our intentions into outcomes. So I think that's the first message. Let me on that reinforce something important that Louis said, right? I can't highlight this enough that, the research in structured pedagogy is remarkably positive, right, around the world. And it's only recently that in Nippon, we've started implementing some of these ideas. So let me take a step back and just describes why this is so controversial, right? So the reason this is controversial is there is a perception that structured pedagogy means you're taking away the teacher's autonomy in the classroom, that what you're doing is just giving them a whole bunch of materials and making them kind of almost robots to translate that material. And so there has historically been a lot of pushback against structured pedagogy from the teaching community. So I think what I want to do is just reinforce what Louis said, but using a slightly different example, right? Which is that if you think about medical education, our philosophy in some ways in medical education and teacher education seems to be exactly the opposite, right? So when you think about medical education, we think about a good quality education as being something that leads to the quality of care and the protocol of care being similar and of high quality, regardless of which doctor sees you, okay? So the whole point of going into a clinic or going to a hospital where I have a trained credentialed doctor is that this doctor is going to treat me in a certain standardized way based on the evidence. Now, this is not saying you're taking away the doctor's autonomy, right? The doctor still has a fair bit of agency in terms of understanding your specific situation and then kind of applying a certain amount of judgment based on that. But the point is that the training, if you look at what is considered effective medical practice, is when I see a patient with a certain set of symptoms, do I follow a well-defined checklist, right? Do I follow a set of actions with regard to diagnosis, with regard to examinations, with regard to tests, and then I use that, and that's based on evidence. And the main point is the individual doctor, regardless of however capable you are, simply doesn't have the capacity to do large sample research and saying what is working across populations of tens of thousands of people. And so similarly with teachers, right? The way you want to think about this is that teachers obviously need a certain amount of autonomy in the classroom to exercise their judgment with regard to the situations in the class. But effective pedagogy is not something that just comes naturally, right? Effective pedagogy is something that we've done and led by people like Louis, where there's been tons of research. And the point about structured pedagogy is not to script everything. It is really to provide the teachers with a kind of a set of guidelines that says, here is the evidence. And if I want to maximize the effectiveness of time spent in the classroom, here is a set of structured instruction and scaffolding that's going to help you get there based on evidence. Okay, so I just want to repeat this again and again, because even though it is in the policy documents, even though Nippon has accepted this, I know there continues to be some resistance in kind of the practitioner community. And so framing this with regard to saying what is the ideals of medical education, I think is a very useful way of doing this, which is to say that there is evidence in research and pedagogy, the structure, the structuring reflects that. And as Louis said, we now have, so I'm part of this global evidence advisory panel on evidence in education, and we just kind of moved this structured pedagogy from something to be considered into what we call the great buys, okay, which are kind of high value for money, where it's shown to be both effective and cost effective. Okay, so I'm just saying that from a research side to reinforce what Louis said. I think the three other independent points I want to make. Okay, so I think the second one is, if we want to convert this moment of national focus on foundational literacy numeracy into action, I think the central piece that's still missing is independent verifiable measurements of learning outcomes. Okay, and that's because, like I said, bureaucracies are very, very good. And this is not, this is not in any way a criticism of any of the individuals concerned, right? This is just more about the system, that the systemic incentives in a bureaucracy is, and one of the most, I'll take a 1-minute diversion into talking about the study in Madhya Pradesh. And so, we did this large-scale study in MP of a school governance reform that looked fantastic. Okay, it had a bunch of global best practices, it had individual assessment, it had school improvement plans, and it really, really looked good. Okay, and then in the end, when we go do this high-quality evaluation, we find that it had absolutely zero impact on learning outcomes, even though on paper the program looked highly successful. Okay, and so the main insight from all of this is that the incentives of bureaucracies are to focus on the appearance of activity, okay, rather than the consequences of that activity. So the program looked successful on paper because you had ticked all the boxes that the school assessments had been done. You had ticked the boxes that the school improvement plans had been uploaded. So on paper and based on what the system was looking at, everything looked like it was working, okay, except that as many scholars of kind of ethnographic studies of the Indian bureaucracy have noted, that down the line, essentially people see their role not so much as empowered agents to kind of deliver outcomes, but really as people who are being assessed on compliance. Okay, so most of our accountability in the system is based on compliance. And so if you want to make so, and the good news is Nipun is talking about FLN. The bad news is we talked about this in the 12th five-year plan as well. Okay, so the 12th five-year plan also talked about foundational literacy and numeracy outcomes. Okay, so in some way, the issue is not that the lack of outcomes, the lack of intention, it's the focus on independent measurement of outcomes. So let me just share one slide, okay, if I'm able to, on kind of the importance of this. Okay, so this is from a paper that my co-author Abhijit Singh did in Madhya Pradesh. And can you see the slide? Okay, and so this simple picture just highlights, right, how fundamental this question of independent, reliable measurement of learning outcomes is. Okay, so basically there is an official test called the Pratibha Parv, which is actually, again, on paper, a very, very well-designed program, because they try to test every child, record the learning outcomes, identify if you're at standard, and if you're not, to make sure you have remedial instructional support. Okay, now what Abhijit did was, and the JPAL team did, which is very, very simple. They took the same data, okay, and they retested a sample of the same kids and the same questions within 4 to 6 weeks of when the official data was recorded. And so you see the extent of this kind of data quality, data integrity problem, that in the official data, you have the red line, okay? So this is learning levels in Hindi, organized from the weakest kid to the strongest kid, and this is in math. And you see that in this official data, there basically is no learning crisis. There is no learning crisis because there's no child who's scoring below 60%. But in the independent data, you see that the true learning levels are overstated by a factor of 2 or 3. And in fact, in maths over here in the independent data, there's no child who scores above 40%, okay? Like compared to the official data where nobody's scoring below 60%. So I think this kind of I consider this, again, one of the most important pictures for kind of governance of education in India. And that's because, we wasted 15 years as a country because we were in denial about the learning crisis, saying that externally generated data by entities like Pratham would not be accepted by the system, okay? So we've now at least woken up to the fact that we can't ignore this crisis. But going forward, my concern is still, and now again, I think a lot of good things have happened. I agree with pretty much everything with regard to structuring, the pedagogy, the content, the alignment of the curriculum, everything that Louis has talked about. But I think at the end, the key missing ingredient right now, is still this measure of independent assessment of progress. And I also agree with Louis completely that this data should not become punitive, because the moment it becomes punitive, the first thing you will get is the fudging of the data, right? So what you need is kind of independent systems. And so one of the approaches I have recommended in my book, which will be out later this year, is that having worked with government for so long, my sense is that the government is kind of the DNA of the government doesn't allow it to accept external data, but the data that is generated from within the department is often manipulated. And this is not just in education, right? You see this in Anganwadis, you see this in ICDS, where the official rate of severe malnutrition reported in the ICDS data will be about 1%. And this is even in high functioning states like Tamil Nadu and Telangana. Okay, so whereas in the NFHS, in independent data, that will look like 7 or 8%. Okay, so I think this issue of over reporting of data is a fundamental governance challenge in every sector, in every state. Okay, so unless we also pay attention to this and make sure we have independent sample-based measurements that it's giving us a barometer that are we making progress, I worry that there is a risk that, as we've seen with previous programs, that the bulk of the focus becomes on inputs and scheme implementation as opposed to focusing on the outcomes itself. Okay, now the good news here is technology, when well deployed, well designed and deployed, can be transformative. So this is in fact a study that Abhijit did in partnership with CSF in Andhra Pradesh. And all that they did was that the student assessment was kind of replaced by a digital tablet-based assessment. And now you see that there's basically 3 margins in which the data gets manipulated, right? The first is you can just copy from the neighboring kid. Second is the teacher can write the answer on the board. And the third is at the time of correction, you can inflate the scores, okay? So what the tablet-based testing does is, because it has a question bank of thousands of questions, you randomize the test so no 2 kids are seeing exactly the same questions. So you can't copy on that margin. You're also doing the correction real time and the data is being uploaded real time. Again, because the questions are different, it becomes much harder to manipulate. And so what you see is that based on just statistical measures of the likelihood of discrepancy, that the tablet-based testing led to almost a 90% reduction in the proportion of schools that were flagged for, cheating. So again, what the evidence suggests is that this issue of data integrity, data quality, independent data and outcomes is central, and that it is possible to solve it. Okay, it's possible to solve it by applying our mind to principles of design. And we can talk more about this, but that's kind of a core message. So and then let me leave. I'm on time. Time. Oh, thanks, Anustup. Okay, let me just leave with this is the problem when I'm trying to both give you data and insights, and I jump into talking about research sites. But let me give you one final thought. Okay, which is the research on effective organizations around the world will basically show you that effective organizations provide autonomy on process to the frontline staff and managers, because you're the one who's close to the problem. So you provide autonomy on process, but accountability for outcomes. Okay, so that because if you're in a company, the guy close to the customer is empowered to solve the problem, but then you're holding accountable for making sure that the problem is being solved. The problem in our Indian bureaucracy and most bureaucracies is we do exactly the opposite, right? We micromanage on process with zero accountability for outcomes. Okay, so one of the important results research studies we have in Tanzania, for example, shows that simply providing resources to schools has very little impact. Providing kind of a little bit of incentives had an effect, but not as much. But providing a combination of untied resources to be used as the teacher and the principal see fit, with a little bit of accountability for improved outcomes, was transformative. Okay, so what this means is just providing a little bit of untied resources to head teachers and principals and district and block level officials, saying that you guys are close to the problem. I'm going to empower you to solve the problem, as opposed to needing approval for every line item of spending. But at the same time, we're going to put in place certain principles of accountability whereby you're increasing funding. So one of the recommendations I have, even with regard to funding, is that we use a formula called what I call a 70-20-10 formula of equality, equity, and effectiveness, right? So, and if you do, for example, a spatial analysis of public spending in education, you'll see it's actually quite skewed, but you can have these principles of saying a certain amount of money, say 70%, follows an equality principle of the same amount for every child. A certain amount follows an equity principle where you say, here are the underperforming areas and you need to provide additional resources for them to catch up. And a certain amount follows an effectiveness principle where you say the most, based on improvements, you tie a little bit of money to that. Small amounts, 5%, 10%. It doesn't have to be big, but I think getting these governance pieces going alongside the pedagogical interventions that are already happening, I think will be a force multiplier for everything we do. And I'm already out of time. So I think there's a final message about the centrality of evidence and cost effectiveness, because education is a really, really, really hard area where, I have a PhD in economics and I have no idea what's going on in my kid's classroom. Okay, so it's an area where, just you need the research, you need the data, and you need to constantly, keep iterating, and like Louis said, only push down things when you have high quality evidence. So let me stop there. There's 3.5 hour podcast for people who want to hear more. So
I think if Amit Verma's podcast with you holds the record for 3.5 hours, I guess this 10 minutes also gets us some kind of a record. And thanks for reminding us, Karthik, about the centrality of independent data, the need to move the needle from inputs to outcomes, and also to emphasize that structured pedagogy is about bringing evidence in the hands of the teacher. Thank you, Louis. Thank you, Karthik. And over to Shavita to close the evening.